The engine had been off for 11 minutes. Ethan Cole knew this because he had been watching the clock on the dashboard the way a man watches something that cannot hurt him, something neutral and indifferent when everything else in his mind is neither of those things. The motel parking lot outside Missoula was half empty at 7 in the morning, the asphalt still dark from a night rain that had moved east before dawn. The sky was the color of old pewter, pressed low over the mountains like a lid being slowly closed. On the passenger seat, Ash sat upright, facing forward as he always did when the truck was stopped. He was a Belgian Malinois, 9 years old, with a double coat the color of wood ash and winter frost. His muzzle had gone white over the past 2 years, the pigment fading the way light fades at the end of a good day, slowly and without drama. His eyes were amber, not the common brown amber of most dogs, but the deep translucent amber of the real thing, the kind you could hold up to a window and see light move through. He did not fidget. He did not whine. He simply sat and waited and watched the same middle distance that Ethan was watching. On the back seat sat a single cardboard box, medium size, moving tape across the top, still sealed from 3 months ago when Ethan had packed it in the apartment in Spokane and then not unpacked it because unpacking it would have meant deciding to stay, and he had never been able to decide to stay. Inside the box were 4 changes of clothes, a field medical kit, 2 books he had not opened in 2 years, a photograph of a unit he no longer spoke to, and a coffee mug his daughter had given him with the words, "World's Okayest Dad," printed in blue. He had kept the mug, he was not sure why. Ethan Cole was 47 years old. He was lean in the way that men who work hard and eat plainly are lean, not fashionably thin, but functionally spare. Nothing carried that did not need to be there. His hair was brown, shot through with silver at the temples, cut short by habit rather than preference. There was a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, pale and thin as a seam from a firefight in Kunar Province in 2007, that he never mentioned and never forgot. His hands on the steering wheel were still. They were the hands of a man who had learned to keep things still. On the passenger floor was a printout from the Flathead County Property Records Office. He had driven 4 hours to look at it in this parking lot rather than at a desk somewhere because looking at a piece of paper in a truck felt less like a decision and more like a direction. The property was listed as Parcel 7B, 160 acres. One cabin condition described in the official language of bureaucracy as poor. One well status unknown, 15 years of unpaid property taxes, auction price starting at $500. He looked at the printout for another moment. Then he folded it, put it in his shirt pocket, and started the engine. Ash looked at him. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Let's go." The Flathead County Administrative Building was a structure that communicated nothing except the desire to communicate nothing. Brick from the 1960s, a color somewhere between tan and apology. The parking lot had puddles in the low spots. The American flag out front moved in the November wind with the tired authority of something that has been flying too long in one place. Inside the room smelled of old paper damp wool coats and the particular bitterness of coffee that has been sitting on a burner for 2 hours past the point of goodness. Folding chairs were arranged in rows facing a small raised platform where a man in his mid-50s stood behind a podium with a gavel and the expression of someone performing a civic duty he had long since stopped finding meaningful. Ethan took a seat in the back row. Ash settled under the chair, his broad head resting on his forepaws, eyes open. The room held maybe 30 people. Farmers in worn flannel, a few younger faces with the sharper eyes of speculators looking for distressed property to flip. A couple of older couples who sat together with the settled ease of people who had been in the same room together so many times that proximity had become its own language. He watched them the way he had learned to watch rooms in places very far from Montana. Not looking for threats exactly. Reading the weather of the space. The auctioneer moved through the list with the rhythm of a man who has said the same words so many times they have lost all personal meaning. A 2015 pickup truck, woodworking equipment, a bungalow on the east side of town. For each item, hands went up, voices called, numbers, the gavel came down. Then the auctioneer cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and said the words that Ethan had been waiting for. "Next item, Parcel 7B, known locally as the Old Hard Place." The room changed. It did not change loudly. No one stood or spoke or turned their head in any dramatic way. But the quality of the air shifted the way air shifts before weather moves in. The low hum of side conversations stopped. A woman in the third row looked down at her hands. The older farmer in the front row, a man with hands like worn leather and shoulders that had carried decades of outdoor labor, became very still in his chair without appearing to try. The auctioneer continued in a voice that had lost even the minimal enthusiasm it previously carried. Property consists of 160 acres, one cabin in poor condition, one well of unknown status. The property is sold as is. It comes to the county through tax delinquency. 15 years of unpaid property taxes. 15 years. The number sat in the stale air like something that had been left there a long time ago, and nobody wanted to touch. "We will open bidding at $500. Ethan raised his hand, a calm gesture unhurried. The auctioneer found him. "I have 500 from the gentleman in the back." "Do I hear 600? Silence. Not the competitive pause of earlier lots where someone was doing arithmetic and deciding. This was a different kind of silence. A decided silence. A silence that had been decided long before this morning by people who were not present and some who were, and it sat in the room with the comfortable permanence of a tradition everyone has agreed to maintain without discussing. Ash lifted his head from his forepaws. His ears moved, reading the room's emotional frequency the way he had always been able to read things Ethan could not. "Going once," the auctioneer said, and his voice carried the mild relief of a man who wants to be done with something that makes him uncomfortable. "Going twice." The farmer in the front row turned just slightly and looked at Ethan. His face was weathered to the color and texture of creekstone after a long summer. He gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Not hostile, not warning a stranger away from a bargain, warning a person away from something the farmer understood and the stranger did not yet and probably would not be able to turn back from once he did. "Sold." The gavel came down and the sound of it in that particular silence was sharper than it should have been. When Ethan walked to the front to sign the paperwork and pay the $500 in cash, the room broke into low conversation behind him, the way a dam releases water when the pressure finally exceeds its design. He caught pieces of it without trying. Something about not knowing what he had bought. Something about the heart place said with a particular emphasis, the kind people use for words that have accumulated years of careful avoidance until the word itself carries the weight of everything never said about it. The clerk who processed his payment was a young woman, early 20s, with the kind of nervous energy that expressed itself in careful stillness rather than movement. She processed the paperwork efficiently and pushed the deed toward him across the counter without looking at his face. Not rudely, more like a person handling something they would prefer to handle at arm's length. Ethan took the deed, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket next to the property printout. Outside, the Montana air was cold and clean after the stuffed warmth of the room. He stood on the steps for a moment, Ash beside him, and looked down the main street of Crestwood toward the mountains at the edge of the sky. They were blue and sharp and indifferent in the way that large permanent things are indifferent, unconcerned with the small human transactions occurring at their feet. The supply list was short. He had learned long ago that a short supply list was better than a long one because a long one meant you were planning to be comfortable. And planning to be comfortable meant you were planning to stay, and planning to stay required a kind of certainty about the future that he had not carried in some years. He thought about what a short supply list required. A padlock for the door because whatever this place had been, it was his now, and what was in it was his concern. Lamp oil because the electricity had been disconnected with the taxes and would not come back until he arranged it, and there were things he could do by firelight that he could not do in total darkness. Ground coffee because some things are not negotiable. An axe handle because the one on the axe in the woodpile he had seen from the property description was certainly rotted through, and a Montana November without the ability to make a fire quickly and sustain it was a particular kind of uncomfortable he had no interest in. A padlock, lamp oil, ground coffee, an axe handle. The sign above the door read Pruitt's General Store in letters that had been painted sometime in the previous century and not repainted since. The bell above the door announced him. Inside sawdust leather, fresh ground coffee, the smell of a place that sells things people actually need rather than things people think they want. The man behind the counter was 70 years old and built like a man who had been 70 years old his entire life, thin with the wiry permanence of someone who had never carried extra weight because there was always work to do. His apron was canvas. His eyes were pale blue and sharp in the way of people who have been watching the same horizon for decades and learned to notice what changes along the edge of it. He gathered Ethan's items without being asked twice and studied him openly in the way that people in small towns do when they have decided that being direct is more respectful than pretending not to look. You're the one who bought the Hart place this morning, Pruitt said. Not a question. I am. Pruitt set the padlock on the counter. He leaned against it with the comfortable authority of a man in his own store in his own town who has earned the right to say things that need saying without being invited to say them. I hope you don't mind an old man speaking plainly. I don't. Daniel Hart came here in 2007. Pruitt said, his voice dropping to the register people use for things that matter. Journalist from Baltimore. The kind of man who asked questions the way other men breathed like he couldn't help it and wouldn't stop even if he tried. He was looking into land acquisition practices in this valley. GeoCorp, the mining outfit, had been quietly buying up property through intermediaries using legal instruments that took lawyers to understand. Hart was documenting it. Pruitt wiped the counter with a cloth, though the counter was already clean. Then one November morning in 2009, his truck was parked in front of his cabin. But Daniel Hart was gone. No sign of struggle, no note, no body ever found, just gone. Ethan listened with the patience of a man who knew that information given freely and honestly was worth more than information extracted. GeoCorp tried to acquire that parcel 3 times in 15 years, Pruitt continued. Each time the county's public auction law blocked them. You cannot buy tax-forfeited land directly. It has to go to open auction. He paused. Warren Gale, who runs GeoCorp, came in here once, 8 years ago. He did not threaten me, did not offer me anything. He sat right where you are standing and asked me very politely if anyone ever expressed interest in that parcel, could I let him know. Pruitt's pale eyes held Ethan's steadily. I said no. He thanked me and left. Did not seem angry. Ethan waited. That is what kept me awake for 3 nights after, Pruitt said. Not because he was frightening, because he looked like a man waiting for something he believed was inevitable. Patient in a way that was worse than impatient. He set the lamp oil on the counter beside the padlock. Roy Lattimore, the man in the front row this morning. He turned and looked at me before the gavel came down, Ethan said. Pruitt's expression shifted slightly. Roy lost 40 head of cattle over 2 years before GeoCorp came into this valley. Veterinarians could not explain it. Neurological symptoms. Then the animal simply died. He looked at Ethan directly now, the pale eyes carrying something that was not pity exactly, but was in its neighborhood. The creek that runs through Roy's lower pasture has a faint metallic smell. People around here got so used to it, they stopped noticing. A pause. Roy's son Brian is 35 now, chronic kidney disease. Diagnosed 4 years ago. Brian grew up drinking that water. Ethan stood still for a moment with his hand resting on the counter. I appreciate you telling me, he said. I am not telling you to scare you away, Pruitt said. I stopped believing that would work when I watched you sit in the back of that room and not flinch when nobody else raised their hand. I am telling you because whoever comes to that land next ought to know what they are walking into. Daniel Hart went in knowing something was wrong. I never found out how much he knew before it was too late to ask him. Ethan paid for the supplies in cash, picked up the bag, moved toward the door. Whatever Daniel Hart left behind, Pruitt said quietly to Ethan's back, if he left anything behind, it was meant to be found. He was that kind of man, meticulous, purposeful. He did not do anything without a reason, and he did not leave a place without being sure he had done what he came to do. The bell above the door marked Ethan's departure. Outside, the sky had taken on the particular gray that in Montana means weather is deciding whether to arrive now or wait until it can arrive worse. He stood at the truck for a moment, hand on the door, and looked down the long, empty road that would eventually become gravel, and then dirt, and then 2 ruts through the wilderness, and then the place he had just purchased for $500 in a decision he had not known he was making until it was already made. He opened the door. Ash jumped in. Ethan followed. He took one more look at the long street of Crestwood before pulling out. It was a town that had learned to live with something it could not name and could not fully release, a town that had organized itself around an absence. The way small communities sometimes do, the way the space left by someone or something becomes part of the geography. After enough time, a landmark that does not appear on any map, but that everyone navigates around by instinct. He had lived in places like this before. He had learned that the instinct to navigate around something is not always wrong, but it is also not always enough. The road gave up its civility in stages. Pavement became gravel. Gravel became packed dirt, became two ruts that the truck's tires settled into with a resigned familiarity, as if the truck had always known it would end up here. The landscape around them opened into the kind of space that either liberates a person or terrifies them depending on what they have been carrying and for how long. Ash sat forward, nose working at the half-inch gap Ethan had left in the passenger window, cataloging the arriving world of sense with the focused pleasure of a professional doing work that he was built for. Ethan drove and thought about Roy Lattimore's son drinking water from a creek for 35 years, while the company upstream understood what was in that water and made the calculation that it was manageable. The obstacles on the access path were the first thing that registered as wrong. Not dramatic, not obvious, but wrong in the specific way that trained attention identifies when something natural has been made to look natural while not being natural at all. A large pine had fallen across the path at the sharpest curve, positioned so that any vehicle had to slow almost to a stop and navigate a tight, difficult turn. The tree was weathered. It had been there years, but the angle of the fall was too precise for random chance, and the roots at the base showed no signs of the rot or disease that brings mature trees down in calm weather. It had not fallen. It had been placed. 100 yards further, a dense thicket of thorny brush crowded the right side of the path, forcing the truck dangerously close to a drainage ditch that dropped sharply on the left. The brush was old and well-established, but the spacing of the plants along the path's edge was too regular, the density too uniform, on exactly this side and not the other. Planted. Ethan had spent enough time in enough places to know the difference between wilderness reclaiming ground and wilderness being directed toward a specific purpose. Someone had designed this path to be difficult, not impassable. Difficult in the specific way that discourages the casual, the curious, and the opportunistic, while remaining navigable by anyone with patience and a sufficient reason to be patient. The clearing appeared after another 10 minutes of careful driving, and there it stood. The cabin was smaller than the county description had suggested, built of dark logs chinked with mortar that had crumbled to gray powder in the decades since it was laid. The porch along the front sagged on the left side where a support post had rotted through to nothing. The windows were dark, filmed with years of grime that turned them from transparent to opaque, making the interior invisible from outside. The stone chimney rising from the steep roof was furred with moss, patient and unhurried in its colonization of everything the fire had warmed. It looked tired in the specific way that abandoned things look tired when they have been waiting longer than was reasonable to expect anything to wait. Ethan killed the engine. The silence that followed was enormous, interrupted only by wind through the tall pines that ringed the clearing and the distant sound of water moving over stones somewhere to the east, a sound that would become familiar to him over the days that followed in the way that water sounds become the baseline of a place. "All right," he said quietly. "This is it." Ash did not jump out first, as he always did when the truck stopped somewhere new. He sat in his seat, nose pointed at the cabin, pulling long, slow draws of air through his nostrils. His body was still, but the quality of that stillness was different from his usual calm. It was the stillness of attention brought to bear on something specific, the narrowing of a very good instrument onto a single point of interest. When Ethan got out and came around the truck, Ash stepped down and moved immediately to his left side. Not exploring, not ranging ahead the way he normally did in new outdoor spaces. Staying within arm's reach, which he only did in environments he had not yet decided were safe. They crossed the clearing together and climbed the porch steps, which groaned but held. The front door was unlocked. It swung inward on hinges that had not been oiled in 15 years, opening into a room of dim light and deep cold, and the particular smell of abandonment. Cold ash and mouse in the deep earthen scent of wood returning slowly to the forest it had come from. The objects on the table stopped Ethan before he had taken 3 steps inside. A ceramic mug with a faded blue ring painted around the rim. Inside it, the remnant of coffee had dried to a hard black layer against the bottom. A book face down, its pages slightly curled from years of humidity, cycling through the unheated space. He could see the title without moving it, All the President's Men. The book that was for a certain generation of journalists what the Bible was for another generation of believers, a touchstone, a foundation, a reminder of what the work was for. On the hook beside the door, a heavy wool coat, the right pocket pulled outward by the weight of something inside. A man does not run from a cabin in November and leave his coat on the hook. A man does not disappear forever and leave his book face down on the table like he stepped out to get water and is coming back in a moment. These were not the relics of departure. They were the relics of interruption. Daniel Hart had not left this place. He had been taken from it. Ethan stood in the center of the room and felt the particular weight of spaces where the natural order of things has been violated, where something was interrupted that should have been allowed to complete itself. He had stood in rooms like this before in other countries, under other skies, and the feeling was always the same. Not supernatural, not romantic, simply the human sensitivity to absence made sudden and wrong. Ash had been conducting his own inspection, moving methodically around the perimeter of the room, nose working the baseboards, the corners, the cold frame of the iron bed, the area beneath the window. Standard sweep, familiar behavior. The thorough assessment of a professional in a new space, until it stopped being familiar. The dog went still in front of the fireplace. Not the attentive stillness he had shown in the truck while processing the new environment. This was different. This was the full-body arrest that Ethan had learned to recognize as distinct from any other kind of stillness Ash produced. Every muscle locked at once, as if something had sent a signal through the dog's entire system simultaneously. The fur along his spine rose in a single line from the base of his collar to the root of his tail. A sound began in his chest, not a growl exactly, not quite, more like a vibration, a low, continuous frequency that Ethan felt in his own sternum more than heard with his ears. Ethan had seen this exactly twice before in the 9 years they had worked together. Once in Kandahar in 2009, before they found a weapons cache buried under a packed dirt floor in a structure that had looked completely ordinary from every visible surface. Once in Mosul in 2011, before they located a tunnel entrance hidden beneath a concrete slab that had been painted to match the surrounding floor, with considerable skill and patience. Both times, if they had walked past what Ash was signaling, they would not have walked anywhere afterward. "Ash," Ethan said quietly. The dog did not look at him. His amber eyes were fixed on the base of the fireplace, with the absolute excluding focus of an animal that has reduced the universe to one point and will not be redirected from it. Ethan got the lantern from his pack and lit it. He crossed the room slowly and crouched beside the dog, holding the lantern close to the stone base of the hearth, and he looked. He did not look casually. He looked the way he had been trained to look, in the way years of experience had refined that training into something almost automatic. Looking for what did not fit. Looking for what was too consistent. Looking for what had been made to look like something else, but had not quite been made well enough, or had been made well once, but had drifted over time into slight inaccuracy. The fireplace was built of riverstone. The rounded, irregular shapes fitted together with old mortar that had dried to a sandy gray powder over the decades. But the large, flat, rectangular slab of slate in the dead center of the hearth base was surrounded by mortar that was darker, slightly more uniform. And when Ethan pressed the tip of his utility knife into the joint at the edge of that slab, the blade did not crumble through dry sand. It pressed in. The material gave slightly with a faint, rubbery resistance that dry mortar never has, that only a sealant has, something applied not to bond permanently, but to seal temporarily while appearing to bond. Pitch, hardened over years, dusted with ash and soot to match the surrounding stone, the disguise, patient and careful and nearly perfect. But pitch, a sealant, not a bond. This stone had been designed to come out. It had been put there by a person who understood that it would need to come out and who had prepared for that necessity while making every effort to ensure that the preparation would not be detected by the wrong people. He looked at Ash. The dog had not moved. The amber eyes held the same fixed certainty they had held from the moment he first went still. "You found it," Ethan said. The words were quiet, said to the dog, without self-consciousness in the register they had developed over years of working together in places where language between humans was often either impossible or actively dangerous. Ash, for the first time since entering the cabin, moved his gaze from the stone to Ethan. 1 second of direct amber eye contact, then back to the stone. Ethan got the crowbar from his pack. The work was slow and careful because slow and careful was the only way to do it without destroying what might be underneath. He worked the flat end of the bar into the joint he had scraped clean, leaning his weight into it steadily rather than forcing it in a single push. The pitch cracked in small sections, parting with sounds like something sealed too long, protesting the violation of its seal. He worked around all 4 edges before attempting to lift, understanding the stone's weight and placement, before asking it to move. When he finally leveraged it up from one side and gripped the edge with both hands, the slab resisted with the inertia of 15 years of being left alone in the dark. Then it shifted. He worked it sideways across the wooden floor, the stone scraping with a sound that seemed too loud for the surrounding silence, until it rested free of the opening. Below was a cavity lined with rough brick approximately 4 feet deep, dry. The brick lining was deliberate, not incidental, constructed by someone who understood that heat would move down from the active fireplace above and moisture would move in from the ground below, and who had planned against both of those things with care and forethought. Two objects rested at the bottom. A military surplus ammunition box, dark green, the standard M2A1 pattern, designed to be waterproof, shockproof, and airtight, the kind of container that field personnel use for documents or materials that cannot be replaced under any circumstances. Whoever had chosen it knew exactly what they were choosing and precisely why. A stack of 4 leather-bound notebooks tied with a length of natural twine that had faded from brown to pale tan over the years. On the spine of each, written in permanent marker in a small, clean hand, D.H. Volume 1, D.H. Volume 2, D.H. Volume 3, D.H. Volume 4. Ethan lowered himself into the cavity, retrieved both objects, and set them on the floor beside the open stone. He sat down with his back against the wall opposite the fireplace. Ash came and settled against his left leg, the dog's warmth a quiet, steady fact against the cold of the room. Outside, the first sounds of wind were building in the pines, the advance guard of the storm that had been written in the sky all day. He opened the first notebook. The handwriting was precise, and even the hand of a person trained in a period when penmanship was still taught as a discipline, when the ability to produce legible writing was considered part of professional competence. It was not decorative. It was functional clarity, the writing of someone who set down words so other people could read them without effort, which was its own form of professional courtesy extended across time and circumstance. The first page held 6 lines and nothing else. If you are reading this, I am no longer here to say it myself. My name is Daniel Hart. I am an investigative journalist. I came to Flathead County, Montana in the spring of 2007 to write about land acquisition practices by a company called GeoCorp. What I found was something I did not go looking for and could not, having found it, ignore. The people of this valley are drinking poisoned water. They do not know it. GeoCorp does. And certain individuals in positions of local authority know it as well. I have tried 3 times to get this documentation out. Each time something intervened. If you are reading this, please do not let it stop here. Ethan read the 6 lines a second time. Then he set the notebook open on his knee and looked up at the low ceiling of the cabin where the firelight he had not yet built was not yet moving in the dimness. And he thought about Roy Lattimore's son Brian, 35 years old, living with 60% kidney function in a town downstream of a company that had known the water was dangerous and had made the calculation that it was manageable. He thought about the silence in the auction room when the gavel came down. He thought about Elmer Pruitt wiping a counter that was already clean. He looked down at Ash, who was watching him with the amber eyes that had been watching him for 9 years, through deployments and the long, awkward slide back to civilian life, and the apartment in Spokane, and now this cold cabin in November, with the wind beginning outside and a dead man's notebooks open on his knee. "Okay," Ethan said. His voice was quiet in the empty room, the kind of quiet that is not emptiness, but decision. He turned to the next page and kept reading. The storm did not arrive that night. It arrived the next morning, and it arrived the way serious things arrive, without announcement, without drama, simply present in a way that made it clear it had always been coming, and the only variable had been timing. Ethan woke in the truck where he had slept with the wool blanket pulled to his chin and Ash curled against his legs, the dog's warmth the only reliable heat in the cab. The first thing he saw through the windshield was snow, not falling yet, but imminent, in the sky, which had the compressed, purposeful gray of a sky that has made up its mind. By the time he had transferred the essential supplies from the truck bed into the cabin, the first flakes were coming down fat and wet, the kind that stick to everything and accumulate fast. He built a fire in the hearth using wood from the sagging stack on the porch, grateful that whoever had last occupied this place had cut and stored enough to last a season. The fire caught quickly, and the stone of the fireplace, cold through to its core after 15 years without use, began the slow work of absorbing heat. Ash did not settle. With the fire building, his anxiety around the hearth intensified rather than ease, the dog pacing in tight circuits before the stone base, his claws making a soft rhythmic sound on the wooden floor. But the stone was back in place, the seam disguised again with a layer of ash and dirt Ethan had worked into the joint before sleeping. The notebooks and the ammunition box were back in the cavity below. He had read through volume 1 and half of volume 2 by lamplight the previous night, and what Daniel Hart had documented was both more methodical and more damning than Ethan had anticipated. Hart had not been an emotional writer. He wrote the way a good carpenter builds each piece fitted to the next with precision. Nothing decorative, nothing wasted. Dates, locations, chain of custody for every sample taken, names spelled out in full with titles and organizational affiliations noted carefully. The kind of documentation that was written to survive a courtroom, not to survive a conversation. The water samples came first. 14 collection points across the valley, each marked with GPS coordinates, each labeled by date and condition. The laboratory analysis from an independent facility in Bozeman used numbers that Ethan, who had no background in environmental chemistry, could nonetheless read clearly enough. The threshold values were listed alongside the measured values, and in column after column, the measured values were multiples of what they should have been. Arsenic, lead, industrial solvents, the kind of contamination that does not come from natural sources, that comes from extracted materials being handled without adequate containment, and the residue finding its way into groundwater through the patient invisible pathways that water always finds eventually. The topographical map in the ammunition box showed where those pathways led. Every high-concentration sample point was downstream of a GeoCorp operational site. The pattern was not ambiguous. It was the kind of pattern that once seen made it impossible to attribute what was happening to coincidence or accident or the ordinary indifference of industrial activity. Hart had known exactly what he had. He had written it with the controlled, careful tone of someone who understood that the more explosive the information, the more restrained the presentation needed to be. Emotion would give people a reason to dismiss it. Evidence documented correctly and precisely gave them no such reason. Now Ethan sat at the table with Volume 3 open before him, and the fire doing its slow work of warming the room, and he read what Hart had written about Warren Gale. The interview with Phil Stanton had taken place in a diner in Billings in March of 2009, 8 months before Hart disappeared. Stanton had been a senior geologist with GeoCorp for 11 years before resigning in 2006. He had agreed to speak only after Hart had spent 4 months building enough trust through smaller, verifiable interactions that Stanton believed the story would actually be published, that he was not providing information into a void that would swallow it and leave him exposed for nothing. What Stanton described was not the story of a company that had been built on criminal practice from its founding. It was a more complicated story, and Hart had written it as such without flattening it into something simpler than it was. GeoCorp's contamination problem had originated under the tenure of Raymond Gale Warren's father, who had founded the company in the late 1980s and run it with the operational philosophy of a generation that regarded environmental regulation as government interference in legitimate private enterprise. The cheapest method was the standard method. Containment that met minimum legal standards was adequate containment. The residue that went into the ground was the ground's problem, not the company's. Warren Gale had inherited full operational control in 2004. Within a year, he had commissioned an internal environmental audit, the results of which told him what the valley's water quality had been telling anyone who looked carefully for over a decade. The cost of remediation, including site closure, soil treatment, and groundwater recovery, was estimated at $200 million. The cost of compensation to affected landowners and residents, if liability were established in court, was incalculable by any model Stanton had seen applied. The company would not survive either one in any recognizable form. Ethan read Stanton's account of Gale's response to this information as Hart had transcribed it from his notes of the interview. He sat with it for a moment before continuing. In 2005, the same year, Warren Gale received the audit results that told him exactly what his company had been doing to the valley for 15 years. His son Thomas, 19 years old, and 3 months into his first year of college, was diagnosed with a brain tumor. The treatment protocol that offered the best survival probability was available only at a private oncology center in Houston. It cost $3 million per year. Standard insurance, even good insurance, did not come close to covering it. Gale had chosen to continue operating, to suppress the audit results, to purchase the silence of the county officials whose cooperation and inaction he needed, and to pay for his son's treatment with money that kept coming in because the contamination that was making people sick continued to be produced by operations that continued to run. Hart had written a single paragraph below Stanton's account, set apart from the journalism by a brief line written in a register that was different from the rest of the notebook. More personal, more uncertain. Hart had written, "I do not know what to do with this information about Thomas Gale. Warren Gale is a criminal. What he has done to this valley and the people in it is not mitigated by why he did it. And yet I find myself sitting in this diner after Stanton leaves and thinking about the choice as Gale faced it, not as I face it now from the outside, but as he faced it, then a new kind of knowledge on one side and a dying son on the other. I am not sure I know what I would have done. I am not sure that uncertainty makes me a better journalist or a worse one." Ethan set the notebook down for a moment and looked at the fire. He thought about decisions made under pressure in the space between two unbearable options, decisions that could not be fully understood by anyone who had not stood in that exact space. He had made decisions like that. He had lived with some of them easily and others with difficulty, and a few with the particular difficulty that never fully resolves itself, that simply becomes part of the landscape of a person's interior life, present always, but not always in the foreground. He picked the notebook back up and kept reading. The third volume of Hart's notebooks shifted in character partway through the way a piece of music shifts when the underlying theme has been established, and the composer begins to develop it into territory that was always implied but not yet reached. The first two volumes were documentation, precise, controlled evidence building. The third was that too, but underneath the documentation ran a second current, the record of a man becoming aware that the thing he was investigating had become aware of him. The first sign had been subtle, an official inspection of his septic system conducted without prior notice by a county inspector. Hart had never seen before, citing a complaint that had no record of being filed and no complainant willing to identify themselves. The fine issued was modest. The message delivered was not about the fine. It was about the fact that someone knew where he lived and had the authority to knock on his door without a reason that would hold up to scrutiny, and they wanted him to know this. The second incident was his chimney. An inspector arrived 3 weeks after the first, citing a complaint about the chimney's condition, despite the fact that the chimney had been inspected the previous spring and cleared as serviceable. The conditions cited in the new complaint could not be located during the inspection, but the inspector documented his visit and left a notice of potential violation that would require a follow-up inspection at a date to be determined. The cost of remediation, if the violation were confirmed, was not stated in the notice. It did not need to be. The third and fourth incidents involved property line disputes, official-looking documents appearing that suggested the surveys on record were inaccurate, and that Hart's land was potentially smaller than he believed it to be by a margin that would have placed his cabin structure in violation of setback requirements. The documents were not fraudulent. They had been commissioned from a legitimate surveying firm. The survey itself had been designed to produce a specific result. Hart had his own survey done at his own expense, which produced different results, and the dispute sat unresolved in county records, generating legal costs on both sides. Hart had written about each of these incidents in the careful, dispassionate voice he used for everything he documented. But in the margins of Volume 3, he had made notes in a different hand, faster and less controlled notes, that were clearly written at moments when the dispassionate voice was not what he had available. One margin note beside the account of the property line dispute read, "They are trying to bury me in paper. Not kill the story, bury me in it, make me spend all my time and money defending myself so I have nothing left to spend on the work. This is patient. This is organized. This is someone who has done this before." Another note 3 pages later, beside a brief account of a source going silent without explanation. "After 2 preliminary conversations, Dale came by today. We had coffee. I did not tell him about Stanton. I almost did. This is the thing about trust built over decades. It makes you want to give it things even when you should not. I have to be careful. I do not know yet where the edges of what I can trust are." Ethan read that margin note twice, then he sat with it. Hart had known. Not everything, not with certainty, but enough to be careful, and not careful enough to prevent what happened. Or perhaps careful enough to prevent it from mattering in the end, because what he had been careful with was the evidence which was still here, which had outlasted him. The ammunition box also contained, beneath the notebooks, a sealed envelope, addressed in Hart's handwriting to the FBI field office in Billings, Montana. The envelope had never been sent. Inside, as Ethan found when he carefully opened it, was a one-page summary of the investigation. The names of the principals, the locations of the water samples, and a brief statement of intent. I am sending this as a precautionary measure. If you are reading this because I have not followed up with a phone call, please contact the following individuals for the full documentation. Below that were 3 names and contact numbers. 2 of the names Ethan did not recognize. The third was Margaret Hart, listed as next of kin with an address in Baltimore. He sat with that for a long time. Daniel Hart had prepared for the possibility that something would prevent him from making the call himself. He had prepared the envelope, written the summary, provided the contacts, and then had not sent it, perhaps because sending it felt like conceding the outcome, or perhaps because he had believed until he was no longer in a position to believe anything that he would be the one to see it through. The envelope was 15 years old and had never been opened before Ethan opened it. It had waited in the dark of the cavity below the hearthstone in the sealed military ammunition box through 15 Montana winters and 15 Montana summers, patient in the way that prepared things are patient, ready for the moment they would be needed, and the moment had come and they were here. Ethan replaced the envelope in the box and closed it and held the box on his knee for a moment before putting it back in the cavity. Outside, the storm had committed. The snow was coming in earnest now. The kind of accumulation that changes the world's sound by absorbing it, making the already quiet clearing quieter still. The pines at the edge of the clearing were becoming shapes rather than trees, their definitions softening under the white. Ash, who had finally settled after Ethan had spent 20 minutes with a hand on the dog's back until the pacing stopped, lifted his head from the floor. His ears moved. He stood. The sound came a few seconds later. An engine. Through the storm and the trees, unmistakable to ears that had learned to listen for it. No one drives to a forgotten cabin at the end of a forgotten road during the opening of a serious November storm for reasons that are innocent or unrelated to why the cabin was forgotten in the first place. Ethan put the notebook back in the ammunition box, carried the box to the cavity under the hearth. Stone lowered it in and replaced the stone. He worked ash and dirt into the joint with his fingers stood and brushed his hands on his jeans. By the time the engine outside cut off, the hearth looked as it had looked when he arrived. Ash stood at the center of the room, not at the door but slightly back from it, head low in the posture that Ethan recognized as the dog's assessment position, where he had not yet decided what a thing was, but was applying full attention to the question. The knock at the door was heavy, the knock of authority or of someone who had decided to perform authority, regardless of whether they legitimately possessed it. Ethan opened the door. The man on the porch was large, broad through the shoulders, wearing a Flathead County Sheriff's Department winter coat with the kind of practiced comfort that comes from wearing the same uniform for many years, until it becomes less a garment and more a posture. He was perhaps 55, with a thick mustache that covered his upper lip and small dark eyes that were already moving past Ethan and into the cabin before any greeting had been exchanged. His face was weathered in the way of men who have spent long careers outdoors in Montana weather, and there was something in the set of his jaw that was not quite tension, but was adjacent to it, the held quality of a man managing something carefully inside himself, while presenting a surface that does not show the management. "Sheriff Dale Morrow," the man said. His voice was a baritone that had learned over decades of use to deliver information in a register that suggested complete authority and offered no particular warmth. "Got word the deed on this parcel finally transferred. Wanted to check that the new owner had not run into trouble in the storm." The explanation was technically plausible. It would be entered in a log somewhere as a routine welfare check. Ethan let it stand. "Ethan Cole, come in." Morrow stepped inside, bringing cold air and the faint chemical smell of an SUV's interior heated too long. He moved through the room in the way of someone conducting an assessment while performing a social call, the eyes doing their own work independently of what the mouth was doing. He looked at the table, the fireplace, the sleeping bag against the wall, the sparse supplies arranged against the far wall. Ash had not moved from his position in the center of the room. His eyes tracked Morrow with the fixed, unblinking attention of an animal that has registered something and is not going to stop registering it, regardless of what else is happening in the room. "Quite a dog," Morrow said, giving Ash a wide berth as he moved toward the fire to warm his hands. "He is," Ethan said. Morrow held his hands toward the heat and for a moment said nothing at all. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, register slightly dropped toward something that was either more personal or wanted to appear more personal. "Daniel Hart and I went to school together. right here in Crestwood, played on the same baseball team for 3 seasons. He did not look at Ethan while he said it. He looked at the fire. Good man. Curious to a fault, but good. Ethan said nothing. When he disappeared, I was the first officer on scene, Morrow continued. Did a thorough review. No evidence of criminal activity. County and state both closed the case inside of 60 days. He paused for what seemed to be the right length of pause. It bothered me for a long time. Still does. The confession of discomfort was precisely calibrated, Ethan noted. Specific enough to sound personal. Vague enough to commit to nothing verifiable. This land has a history, Morrow said, finally turning from the fire to look at Ethan directly. The small dark eyes were doing a great deal of work behind their flat surface. Not the ghost story kind that people like to tell. The kind where good intentions run into things that are bigger than one person can manage alone. A man who comes here looking for quiet is better served by staying quiet. The silence between them was the kind that carries more information than the words preceding it. I appreciate the advice, Ethan said. Morrow looked at him for a moment with those eyes that were working considerably harder than his expression suggested. Then he nodded, and the nod was the period at the end of whatever sentence he had driven through a blizzard to deliver. He moved toward the door, pulled it open, let himself out into the snow. If you find anything in the cabin, he said, his back to Ethan, one hand on the doorframe, his voice dropping to a register that was almost casual but carried something underneath that was not casual at all. Anything, old papers, containers, anything like that, give me a call before you do anything with it, for your own benefit. He walked to the SUV without waiting for a response. The engine started. The headlights swept across the clearing. The vehicle moved back down the access road and was absorbed by the storm. Ethan pulled on his coat and boots and went out into the snow. The rear driver's side tire. The cut was in the lower sidewall, clean and deep, the kind of cut that a thin, sharp blade makes when drawn with deliberate pressure in a single controlled motion. Not a nail, not road debris, a knife applied by a hand that knew exactly how long the leak would take to become critical and exactly what condition the vehicle would be in by the time the driver discovered the problem. Ethan stood in the snow with the cold working through his coat and looked at the cut for a long moment. Morrow had been inside the cabin for less than 15 minutes. He had been outside alone for less than 3, approaching from the driver's side on his way in and returning to the same side on his way out. 3 minutes was more than enough for a man who had done this kind of thing before. This was not a warning that left room for misinterpretation. This was a message in a language Ethan understood fluently from years of operating in places where the language of action was more precise and more honest than any spoken alternative. We know where you are. We can reach you whenever we choose. You are isolated, and we have made you more so. Consider carefully what you do next. He went back inside and patched the tire with the kit from his pack. The work took an hour in the cold and the snow. When he was finished, he stood in the clearing and looked at the sky, which was committed to the storm through the night and into the following day. He was not going anywhere tonight. The contingency was already in motion. Whatever was watching him from outside the clearing would watch him read. He went inside to retrieve the notebooks from the cavity and kept reading until the fire burned down to embers, and the lamp was the only light in the cabin, and Ash was asleep against his leg, and the storm outside had reached the pitch of something that had decided to stay a while. The following morning brought thin light and accumulated snow, and the particular stillness that follows weather that has exhausted itself for the moment. Ethan spent the morning with the remainder of Volume 3 and all of Volume 4. By the time he had finished, the picture that Daniel Hart had assembled over 2 years of meticulous, patient, dangerous work was complete in its main structure, and the structure was as solid as the stone chimney standing above him. The contamination network was not one illegal site. It was a distributed pattern of inadequate containment across 14 operational locations, each one a slow source of heavy metals and chemical residue, finding its way into the groundwater that fed the valley's wells and creeks in the spring sources that ranchers had relied on for generations. The people drinking that water had no way of knowing what it contained. GeoCorp had actively suppressed 2 independent water quality surveys commissioned by the county using legal and financial instruments that were difficult to trace and designed to be so. The county officials who had enabled that suppression had been compensated in ways that were structured to look like legitimate business relationships and ordinary political support. And buried in the final pages of Volume 4, Hart had documented what had pushed him past the point of uncertainty about his own situation and into the full understanding that he was not going to be allowed to complete this work in the usual way. He had found evidence that someone with access to his movements, his interview schedule, his communication patterns had been providing regular updates to GeoCorp. The evidence was circumstantial, but it accumulated beyond the point of coincidence. Meetings arranged in confidence had been disrupted by sudden official inspections. Sources had gone silent after agreeing to speak without explanation. A package sent through a commercial carrier had arrived opened and resealed with the wrong tape, a small detail that would have meant nothing to most people, but meant everything to a man who had sent that specific package from a specific location to a specific address. The person with access to all of that information was the same person who had responded first to his disappearance and declared the scene clear of criminal evidence within 48 hours. Hart had not written El Moro's name in those final pages. He had written only the person I trusted most in this county has been the instrument of everything that has been taken from me. I cannot write that more clearly than this. If you understand what I mean, you will know what to do with it. Ethan understood. He drove to Kalispell that afternoon, taking the long route and watching the mirror with the steady attention of a man who has learned that habit. The county library had a scanner and a bank of public computers in a quiet corner. He paid cash for a prepaid phone from an electronics store 3 blocks away. He encrypted the scanned documents with a password that only he and one other person on Earth would recognize and sent them from an anonymous email account to a secure address he had maintained for years against precisely this kind of necessity. Then he found a narrow alley between 2 brick buildings, stepped into the wind, and dialed from memory. Connor Reeves picked up on the second ring. Jensen, he said out of old habit the name from a cover exercise they had run together 20 years ago at Fort Benning that had become through the repetition of private reference, a greeting between them that required no context. It's Ethan. Different number. Temporary. A pause, the pause of a man recalibrating. Where are you? What is happening? Montana. I have stumbled into something old and large, GeoCorp mining. A journalist named Daniel Hart who disappeared 15 years ago. I have sent you preliminary documentation to your secure account. The password is the mountain where we got pinned down in 2003. The sound of typing. I see the file. A longer pause. Ethan, this is real. I know it is real. This is federal. GeoCorp has federal contracts. If the contamination evidence holds, we are talking CERCLA violations at minimum, potentially Clean Water Act. And if the official cover-up runs as deep as this documentation suggests, obstruction of justice at the county level, all is just the beginning. A breath. How much trouble are you in? The sheriff visited last night and cut my tire. That is a lower threshold than I was hoping for. I am heading back to the property. Another storm is moving in tonight. Ethan watched the alley entrance, a habit that had never entirely left him regardless of circumstance. Here's what I need from you. If you do not receive a call from this specific number by 6 in the morning tomorrow Mountain Time, you call the FBI field office in Billings. Not state police, not anyone local, federal. He gave Connor the GPS coordinates of the cabin, reading them from the property printout he had carried in his shirt pocket for 3 days. Tell them to come prepared. The line was quiet for a moment with the weight of the instruction between 2 people who understood what it implied. 6 in the morning, Connor said. If I do not hear from you, I call Billings and give them everything you sent me. Everything? All right. The voice of a man who had stood next to Ethan in places where this kind of call had preceded things neither of them discussed afterward. Watch yourself. Always. Ethan removed the battery from the phone, put the 2 pieces in separate trash receptacles on separate blocks. Walked back to the truck where Ash was waiting, sitting upright in the passenger seat, watching the street with the calm of an animal that has learned to trust the person who always comes back. On the drive back toward Crestwood, the sky to the north had the bruised purple color of a storm that had decided to stop being polite about its arrival. Ethan drove into it with the steady speed of a man who has made his decision and is no longer spending energy on the question of whether it was the right one. He almost missed the headlights. They appeared in his rearview mirror as he turned onto the county road that led back toward the cabin access track. A vehicle running without its marker lights at full brightness, keeping a distance that was precise enough to be deliberate rather than coincidental. He tested it, a turn down a gravel spur with no practical destination, a closed gate half a mile in. The vehicle followed. He stopped. The vehicle stopped 300 yards back and waited without moving. Ash had turned in his seat and was looking through the rear window. his body language carrying none of the relaxed curiosity of a dog watching passing scenery. Ethan sat still for the count of 30. The vehicle did not move. He turned the truck around and drove back to the county road. The vehicle let him pass its position and then fell in behind him again at the same careful distance. He drove the rest of the way to the cabin access track in the full knowledge that he was being watched, and he let that knowledge simply be true, the way cold is true. In November, a condition requiring no particular response beyond acknowledgement and continued movement. He had sent what needed to be sent. Connor had what he needed. Whatever happened between now and 6 in the morning was a problem that would be someone else's problem as well. He turned onto the access track. The headlights behind him did not follow. They continued down the county road and were absorbed into the darkness and the incoming snow. Inside the cabin, he rebuilt the fire. He retrieved the ammunition box and the notebooks and set them on the table. He read through Hart's final entries one more time, not to learn anything new, but to hold the full weight of what the man had done, what he had understood and documented and protected, while knowing that his own situation was closing in around him. Daniel Hart had been afraid. The final pages of Volume 4 made that clear, not in any direct statement, but in the way the sentences had changed, become shorter and more compressed. The handwriting slightly less even than the precise control maintained through the previous 3 volumes. He had been afraid and he had kept working. He had been afraid and he had kept the documentation accurate and complete and secured in a place he believed would outlast whatever happened to him. Ash stretched out on the floor beside Ethan's chair, his gray and silver coat rising and falling in the easy rhythm of a dog at rest, though one ear stayed partly raised, monitoring the storm and whatever moved within it. The fire cast its light over the table, over the notebooks, over the long, patient work of a man who had understood that the truth he had found was worth more than his own safety and had acted on that understanding without theatrics or self-congratulation. Just the next correct thing followed by the next until there was nothing left to do but ensure that what he had found would survive him. Outside, the storm pressed against the log walls with the sound of sustained intent, and the clearing disappeared into white, and the cabin became the only warm point in a landscape that had closed completely against the night. Ethan sat with the notebooks and the fire, and the dog, and the weight of 15 years of another man's unfinished work, and he held it carefully the way you hold something fragile and important that has been entrusted to you by someone who no longer can. The first sound was not a sound at all. It was a change in Ash, a shift so subtle that only someone who had spent years reading the dog's body as a secondary language would have caught it. The rise and fall of his breathing had been, even for the past hour, the deep rhythm of an animal conserving energy while remaining technically available. Then without transition, it stopped being that. The breathing continued, but the quality beneath it changed, the muscles beneath the coat going from resting to ready in the space between 1 second and the next, a transition that had no intermediate stage. Ethan had his hand on the rifle before Ash moved his head. The dog rose without sound, turned toward the back wall of the cabin, and held. His tail was down and motionless. His ears were forward. The sound that built in his chest was not the sharp bark of alarm, but something lower and more deliberate, a continuous vibration that carried more information than a bark, because it never stopped long enough to reset. It was the sound of sustained certainty. The back wall, not the front door, which Ethan had barricaded with a table and 2 stacked chairs and secured with the new padlock. The back wall, where a single small window sat high and dark, looking out over the densest section of spruce at the clearing's perimeter, the section most difficult to approach through deep snow and the least likely to be chosen by someone operating quickly, which meant it had been chosen by someone operating carefully, someone who had assessed the obvious approach and decided to use the one that required more patience. Ethan killed the lantern. The cabin dropped into the dim red of the fireplace embers, enough to see shapes and edges, but not detail. He moved to the left wall, away from both the front barricade and the back window, putting solid logs between himself and the most probable approach vectors. Ash shifted with him without being signaled, the dog's ability to track Ethan's position and movement in complete darkness. One of the things that had kept both of them alive in places where darkness was the primary operating environment. He waited. The storm was at its peak, the wind driving snow against the cabin in irregular bursts that made it difficult to separate the sounds of weather from the sounds of human intent. But Ash's focus did not waver, and Ash was better than any instrument Ethan had ever been issued at making that particular separation. The light came first. a thin beam briefly visible through the grime of the back window, moving in a controlled sweep rather than the random pattern of someone using a flashlight for navigation in rough terrain. This was a light being used to check a specific thing, then withdrawn deliberately. A professional economy of illumination. They had learned from the first attempt. They were not coming through the front door this time. They had circled to the position Ethan had assessed as least defensible and were approaching it with time and care, two things that professionals use when they have decided that the initial approach failed because it was too direct. He moved the heavy table from the front barricade and positioned it against the back wall below the window. Not to block the window, which was too small to block effectively with furniture, but to create an obstacle at floor level that anyone coming through would encounter in the dark before their eyes had adjusted to the interior. He taped the wool blanket over the window frame with the duct tape from his pack, cutting off any light from inside and masking any movement visible through the glass. Ash had positioned himself in the far corner of the room, low to the ground in the shadow where the firelight did not reach. His breathing was now completely silent. The vibration in his chest had stopped. He had gone to the place beyond alertness, the operational state that Ethan had watched him enter dozens of times over the years, where the dog stopped being a dog in any domestic sense and became something much older and more precise, the thing that had been bred and trained and refined into an instrument of very specific capability. The footsteps reached audible range perhaps 20 minutes after the light disappeared. More than one set, heavy and deliberate, breaking through the crust of settled snow, with each step the sound of people who were moving carefully but had accepted that the snow would announce them at some point and were compensating with commitment to speed over silence. 3 sets of footsteps, Ethan estimated, possibly 4. The scraping at the back window began quietly. Someone working at the boards Ethan had pressed into the frame, testing them for give, finding the weak point at the lower left corner, applying pressure in the measured increments of a person who had done this kind of thing before and knew that patience was more reliable than force in this particular task. The first board shifted inward. A gap appeared at the edge of the blanket, a thread of cold air and the faint smell of fresh snow entering the room. The second board took longer. Whoever was working it had found a better angle and was applying leverage more efficiently. It gave with a soft crack that the storm half swallowed. A shape came through the opening, controlled and practiced hands first, then the torso dropping to the floor with a lightness that spoke of training and repetition. The figure straightened in the darkness and stood still, letting their eyes begin the process of adjusting one hand, coming up with the angular shape of a pistol already present and oriented. Ethan heard the breathing, short, disciplined, managed by a person who understood adrenaline and had experience working with it rather than against it. This was someone for whom forced entry in low-light conditions was occupational rather than exceptional. But they had not accounted for Ash. The dog covered the distance from the corner in less time than the figure had to process that something was moving toward him. 90 pounds of Malinois, 9 years of drive and precision, and the particular commitment of an animal that has never once in its working life done this halfway hit the back of the figure's legs at knee height in the controlled strike that Ethan had watched him execute in training hundreds of times. The legs buckled forward. The figure went down, arms extending reflexively, the pistol hand swinging wide and losing the controlled orientation it had maintained. Before any recovery was possible, Ash had the forearm. Not tearing, not shaking, simply holding with the full structural commitment of a dog who understood that the arm was the threat and the threat needed to become unable to threaten. The figure cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound of pain and shock overlapping, and the pistol hit the wooden floor. Ethan was already moving. He kicked the pistol into the far corner, put his knee on the figure's back, and held the rifle where it needed to be. "How many outside?" No answer. Ash adjusted his grip by a fraction, a precise and deliberate adjustment. The figure made a sound that was not language. "How many?" "2." The voice was strained with pain and with the quality of someone who had assessed their situation and arrived at honesty as the most efficient remaining option. Outside, front, Ethan zip-tied the figure's wrists with the ties from his pack and moved the person against the wall, away from the window. Ash held his position beside the restrained figure, watching the amber eyes holding the same quality they had held at the fireplace hearth 3 days ago. "I have found the thing. What happens next is yours to decide." The voice from outside came perhaps 4 minutes later. It came through the storm in the way voices carry in heavy winter weather, flattened and strange stripped of normal resonance by cold and snowfall, but identifiable. Ethan had heard it once before in bright daylight, in this same clearing, when it had been smooth and controlled, and professionally pleasant. The voice of a man who had spent a career never being told no for long enough that the refusal had become a condition he was unprepared for. It was none of those things now. Warren Gale's voice in the dark of the storm was the voice of a man who had run out of the version of himself that was able to maintain composure when things did not go according to the plan he had carried for 15 years. What was left underneath that composure was raw and more desperate, the voice of a man who had made too many compounding decisions to have any path available except forward, because backward led to everything he had spent 15 years preventing. "We are out of time," the voice came. "If we cannot get what is in there, then nobody gets it. Burn it. Burn all of it down." A pause, the wind filling the space. Then the sound of liquid against wood, the sharp chemical smell of lamp oil cutting through the cold air and reaching Ethan even through the cabin walls. And then the orange light blooming suddenly at the base of the front wall, the oil catching from whatever ignition source they had brought, and the old dry timber of the cabin taking the flame with the eagerness of something that had been waiting a very long time to fulfill its most basic nature. The fire moved faster than Ethan had anticipated and slower than it felt. He estimated 90 seconds, perhaps a few more, before the interior air became genuinely unsurvivable. He made his decisions in the order of their importance. The hearthstone was sealed. The cavity was dry stone on all sides, sealed against the fire's reach from above by the same thermal mass that had kept it sealed against the fireplace's heat from below for 15 years of use before Hart disappeared. Daniel Hart had built his hiding place with full awareness that fire was one of the instruments available to people who wanted to erase things. The stone would hold. The documents would survive the fire that was now consuming the walls around them. He pulled the bound figure to its feet by the collar. "The front door. You walk first." The figure walked. Ethan pressed behind Ash, moving alongside, and when they reached the barricade, Ethan pulled the table aside in one motion and kicked the chairs away and unbolted the door and drove his shoulder into it and came out into the gray pre-dawn light with the fire at his back painting everything it touched in orange and shadow, and the snow in the clearing turned gold by the light of a building that was eating itself. Ash moved to his left and planted himself in the snow with the low, wide stance of a dog that has decided where he stands. Warren Gale and two other men stood in the clearing. The firelight reached them, showing their faces in relief. The two men flanking Gale had the look of hired competence, men who performed tasks without particular investment in their outcomes, who could assess a situation and make the calculation that required assessing quickly. Gale himself looked like a man who had arrived at the end of something he had not fully understood when he began it 15 years ago, in a year when his father's company and his son's life had presented him with a choice that was not a choice in any clean sense of the word. His coat was expensive and wet with snow. His silver hair was uncovered, flattened by the wind. The easy confidence that had occupied his face in the daylight 2 days earlier was gone, replaced by something that was not quite fury and not quite fear, but carried significant elements of both. He looked at Ethan in the firelight, and at Ethan's side, and at the third member of his team standing in the snow with his wrists bound and his face moved through several expressions before settling on the one that was most his own, the one that had always been underneath all the others. Exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been holding something too heavy for 15 years and whose arms have finally given out. Ethan looked at him and thought of the margin note in Volume 3. The person I trusted most in this county. He thought of Roy Lattimore's son with 60% kidney function. He thought of Daniel Hart sitting in a diner in Billings, trying to understand what he would have done in Warren Gale's position, and writing that he was not sure, and continuing to do his work anyway because the uncertainty about what he might have done did not change what Gale had actually done and what needed to be done about it. There was a moment, brief and clear, as Creekwater, where Ethan looked at Gale and saw not the CEO, not the criminal, not the man who had sent people to his door in the middle of a blizzard, but simply a man who had made a decision he could not unmake and had spent 15 years paying for it in the specific currency of a person who has not yet been caught, which is the knowledge present always at some level of consciousness of what it will feel like when the catching finally happens. The catching was happening now. Whatever Gale felt about it, Ethan could not do anything about that. "You should have taken the money," Gale said. His voice was almost conversational, the way voices sometimes go when the emotion has exceeded the capacity to dramatize it. I gave you a way out of this, a very clean way out. Ethan said nothing. The rifle was not raised. It did not need to be raised. Everything in that cabin is burning, Gail continued. Whatever Hart thought he had, whatever you think you found, it will be ash within the hour. And without physical evidence, there is nothing. There has never been anything that any court would hold together for the full process. Ethan looked at him steadily. The documentation was already handled before you arrived, Gail said, and there was something in his voice now that was moving toward plea rather than threat, the voice of a man trying to convince not his adversary, but some remaining part of himself. It has to be handled, not because of me alone. There are people involved whose exposure would destroy things that should not be destroyed, things that are not about money. You understand that there are things that are not about money. He stopped. The sound came from the north, and it came the way serious things come without warning, without build-up, simply present at a volume that could not be argued with. The rotary percussion of rotor blades heard before seen, felt in the chest cavity, before fully processed by the ear. Low and heavy and deliberate. Then the lights appeared through the snow and the tree line, two aircraft moving in formation. One smaller and bearing the insignia of the Montana State Police, visible even in the gray pre-dawn, and one larger and darker, and bearing no markings that required reading twice by anyone who understood what an unmarked federal aircraft meant and what it carried. The voice from the loudspeaker was enormous in the clearing, bouncing off the tree line and the burning cabin wall, landing on everyone present with the complete authority of a volume that eliminates the option of pretending not to have heard. This is the FBI. Drop your weapons. Get on your knees. You are surrounded. The two men flanking Gail looked at each other with the brief mutual assessment of people doing fast arithmetic in difficult circumstances. They put their weapons in the snow and knelt. The entire transaction took approximately 4 seconds. Money had motivated them to be here. The same practical intelligence that money had rented told them immediately that money was not sufficient motivation for what staying upright would cost. Warren Gale stood. He stood for a long moment with his empty hands at his sides, in the fire behind Ethan throwing light over the clearing, and the two aircraft holding above the tree line with their lights making everything below them visible and exposed and small. He stood and he looked at Ethan with the amber firelight reflected in his eyes, and what moved across his face in those seconds was something Ethan had not anticipated. It was recognition, not of Ethan specifically, of the moment itself, of the place in the sequence of his own choices where the sequence had always been traveling. The destination that 15 years of compounding decisions had always been building toward, that he had spent 15 years pretending was not the destination. Because acknowledging a destination means acknowledging that you are already moving toward it and have been for some time. His hands moved to the pistol at his side. Not fast, not threatening. With the deliberate slowness of a man performing an action he already knows the ending of. He lifted it, held it for 1 second beside his leg, and then placed it carefully in the snow at his feet. The gesture was almost formal, almost like setting something down on an altar, acknowledging what it had been and releasing it. Then he went to his knees in the snow. The agents came from the larger aircraft on rappel lines with the efficient speed of people who have rehearsed a version of this many times. They moved through the clearing with organized calm, securing the three figures, establishing a perimeter, communicating with each other in the abbreviated language of people who have worked together long enough that full sentences are unnecessary. A woman in a dark FBI jacket crossed the clearing toward Ethan. She was 40 with brown hair pulled back and the kind of direct eye contact that comes from years of professional practice at looking at people who would prefer to look elsewhere. She extended her hand. Special Agent Sandra Holt. Your friend in Denver was very persuasive. It is 6 in the morning, Ethan said. He called at 6 on the dot. She looked at the cabin where the fire was beginning to lose its initial ferocity as it worked through the easiest material and reached the denser log walls. He told us the story in enough detail and with enough specific evidence that we moved immediately. He said you would note the time. Ethan looked at the burning cabin. The front wall had gone, and the roof had partially collapsed inward, and the interior was visible as a framework of orange and black. But the fireplace stood. The stone chimney rose from the wreckage intact. The river stones assembled a century ago holding their shape against the fire, the way stone holds against everything that is not stone patient, and unchanged and indifferent to the drama occurring around its base. Gail believes the evidence burned, Ethan said. Agent Holt waited. It is under the hearth, the center stone at the base. The mortar around it is pitch, not cement. It will need a crowbar and someone careful. He looked at her. Daniel Hart was a meticulous man. Whatever is in that cavity is in the condition he left it. Holt looked at the chimney for a moment. Then she turned and spoke quietly into the radio at her shoulder. Ethan became aware in the way that physical reality reasserts itself when adrenaline begins its withdrawal, that Ash had not left his side since they came through the cabin door. The dog was pressed against his left leg with the steady, reliable weight of one partner making contact with another in the aftermath of something difficult. Not anxious, present. He put his hand on the dog's back. Beneath his palm, Ash's breathing was even. And then Ethan felt something he had not expected to feel in this moment, standing in a burning clearing, with federal agents working around him and the remnants of a structure he had owned for 11 days, sending smoke into the pre-dawn sky. Not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. Not satisfaction, though that was present as well. What he felt was the particular quietness that arrives when something you did not know you had been carrying is finally set down, when a weight you had accepted as permanent reveals itself to have been temporary all along. He had not come to Montana to carry anything. He had come to put things down. Somewhere in the gap between those two intentions, Daniel Hart's 15 years of careful, costly work had found its way to the people it had always been intended to reach. They found Roy Lattimore's old truck parked at the edge of the access road, and at 7 in the morning, the man himself standing beside it in his work coat, watching the federal activity in the clearing with the patience of someone who has been waiting for something long enough that its arrival does not require him to rush toward it. Nobody had called him. He had seen the aircraft when they came in low over his property on their approach, and he had understood what aircraft that size and that configuration meant in terms of the kind of trouble that required them. Ethan walked out to him while the agents worked. They stood together beside the truck and looked at the clearing where the cabin's remains still sent up a slow column of smoke into the gray morning sky, and the stone chimney stood in the middle of the destruction, patient and unchanged. "I heard there were helicopters," Roy said. There were. Roy looked at the chimney. He was quiet for a while, the quiet of a man who has learned over 7 decades that silence is more honest than filling space with words that are not ready to be said yet. Did they get what they were looking for, the people who came last night? No. Roy nodded slowly just once. The evidence is intact, Ethan said, all of it. Daniel Hart built that hiding place to last through exactly this kind of event. The old farmer said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the chimney and the smoke, and the agents moving through the clearing with their equipment and their organized professional purpose. His face held the complicated weather of a man receiving information he has waited 15 years to receive, and finding that receiving it does not simplify how he feels, but rather makes clear how many different things he has been feeling simultaneously for 15 years, and suppressing because there was no outlet for any of them. "My boy Brian called me last week," Roy said. 60% kidney function now, down from 65. He paused. He does not complain. He is not built that way. But I know what that number means in 10 years if the trajectory holds. Ethan stood with that. "Daniel Hart came to my property in the summer of 2008, Roy continued. "Spent 2 days, looked at the creek, took his samples, asked his questions. Before he left, he stood in my driveway, and he told me that what he had found was real and that he was going to make sure it came to light." The old man's voice was level, carrying its weight without dramatizing it, the voice of a man who has learned to hold heavy things without shaking. "Then he was gone 4 months later, and I spent a long time thinking about what it means when a person promises you something and then the world takes them before they can keep it." He looked at Ethan. "Does it count?" Roy asked. "If the person who made the promise does not get to see it through?" Ethan considered the question with the seriousness it deserved because it deserved it. "He documented everything," Ethan said. "He kept it safe in a place he built specifically so it would survive him. He wrote it so that whoever found it would know exactly what to do with it and why." He looked at Roy. "I think Daniel Hart understood that he might not be the one to see it through. I think he made his peace with that possibility and kept working anyway. That is not a broken promise. That is a completed one." Roy was quiet for a long time. Ash had come to sit between the two men, without being directed to, as he sometimes did in moments of human significance, that he registered in the way dogs register the emotional temperature of the people they have attached themselves to over years of close proximity. He sat in the snow without apparent discomfort, his gray and silver coat pale against the white ground, and looked out at the clearing with the calm of an animal that has done what it came to do. Roy looked down at the dog. He reached out one of his large, worked hands slowly enough that Ash could read the intention and set it on the dog's broad head. Ash did not move away. He sat and accepted it with the steadiness that had nothing to do with submission and everything to do with knowing what he was. They stood like that for a while, the old farmer and the retired soldier and the dog with the amber eyes, while the federal agents worked in the clearing and the smoke rose straight into the cold morning air because the wind had finally, after days, gone still. The legal process moved in the way that large and complicated legal processes move neither quickly nor cleanly, but with the grinding inevitability of institutions that have been given sufficient material to work with. Agent Holt's office confirmed within 48 hours that the laboratory analysis and Hart's documentation held up to independent verification that 15-year-old samples and 15-year-old data were consistent with current measurements taken from the same locations. The contamination had not improved without intervention. It had in some locations worsened. Sheriff Dale Morrow accepted a plea agreement with the federal prosecutor's office within 3 weeks. He provided a full account of the payment history between GeoCorp and himself. Every transfer, every instruction received the full structure of the arrangement that had been built around him over years. He had not been the instrument of whatever had happened to Daniel Hart directly. That action had been taken by a man in GeoCorp's employ who had died in a single-vehicle accident in 2014, a death that had been investigated as an accident and closed as one, and that was now being reopened. Morrow's sentence was 12 years. He would serve it knowing that he had provided what the prosecutors needed to build the case against the larger structure, and that knowledge was not a comfort to him in any way he could see, because the damage had not been to the structure. The damage had been to Roy Lattimore's son and to the families up and down the valley who had been drinking that water. Warren Gale declined the plea arrangement his lawyer recommended. He chose to go to trial, which his lawyer also recommended against, and which Gale chose anyway, in the way that men who have spent their lives controlling outcomes sometimes choose the option that allows them to maintain the appearance of agency even when the outcome is no longer in question. The evidence assembled by Daniel Hart and confirmed by independent analysis was not the kind of evidence that dissolves under cross-examination. It was the kind that had been built precisely to withstand it. Thomas Gale Warren's son provided a statement to the FBI investigators. He had not known. The tumor had been in remission for 6 years. He was 30 years old working as a landscape architect in Denver, and he had not known, and the investigators appeared to believe him, because believing him was consistent with what the evidence showed about how his father had structured the information around him. Senator Frank Aldridge resigned before the indictment came down. The investigation into his specific role was continuing. It was 2 weeks before Connor Reeves drove up the cleared access road in a rental car that had not yet been broken in by Montana mud season. He stepped out and stood looking at the cleared space where the cabin had been and at what Ethan had already begun in its place. The chimney still stood at the center of the cleared ground. Around it, Ethan had begun laying out the footprint of the new structure in treated timber, the lines straight and the corners square. The work of a man who had been taught construction by the Army and had not forgotten it, and was finding that the act of building something from the ground up with his own hands in a place he owned and intended to remain was a different kind of work than anything he had done in the previous decade. Several stacks of fresh-cut pine from Roy Lattimore's small mill sat along the eastern edge of the clearing. Roy had brought the first load himself in his old truck and had not charged for it, and when Ethan had pointed this out, Roy had said only that he had timber and Ethan needed timber, and that seemed like sufficient logic for the transaction. Connor looked at the footprint of the new structure. He looked at the chimney at its center. He looked at Ethan, who was fitting a crossbeam into its notch, with the focused attention of someone engaged in work that requires all of their present attention and is better for requiring it. "They are calling you a hero," Connor said. Ethan set the beam, checked the level with the small tool from his belt. "Do not write it that way." "I know. I will not." Connor walked to the nearest timber stack and sat on it with the manner of a man who has driven 4 hours and is not going to pretend he does not need a moment. "Holt's office told me the lab confirmation came through on Hart's contamination data, independent verification across 6 separate facilities. The measurements held up across 15 years. GeoCorp is looking at CRCLA liability that will exceed their asset value under any model the remediation specialists have applied. Ethan picked up the next beam. Gail is going to trial, Connor continued. His lawyer thinks it is a mistake. It probably is. But the documentation Hart built does not leave much room for the alternative narratives that a trial defense requires. He paused. The first piece runs Sunday, 6 parts over 3 weeks. The Atlantic is running a condensed version simultaneously. He looked at Ethan's back as Ethan worked. I want to credit Daniel Hart as the primary author of this story. My role in it was delivery. His was the work over 2 years at considerable personal cost. He would have wanted that, Ethan said. I know. Connor was quiet for a moment. What comes next for you? Ethan looked at the timber frame taking shape around the chimney that had survived everything put to it. He looked at the mountains to the north, still carrying snow on their upper faces, though the valley had turned the tentative green of late Montana spring. He looked at Ash, who had taken up a position on the original hearthstone, the flat slate slab that had covered the cavity for 15 years, which Ethan had set deliberately at the center of the new structure's floor plan, a decision that required no explanation to himself. The dog sat on it in the spring sun, with his eyes half closed, the gray and silver of his coat warm in the light of a day that had decided to be generous looking, like something that had always been there, like something the place had been waiting to receive. I'm going to finish building, Ethan said. 3 days after Connor left, Ethan drove out to Margaret Hart's small house, east of town, along the county road that ran parallel to the creek he had come to know as the eastern boundary of what was now his property. Margaret Hart was 61 years old. Small with white hair cut practically short, and eyes that were the blue of a sky that has been through weather and emerged clear on the other side. She opened the door before he reached the porch as if she had heard him coming, in some way that had nothing to do with sound. She looked at him with those eyes and said nothing for a moment, simply looked at him and at Ash standing at his side, and her face held the expression of a woman who has been carrying something for a very long time and can see from the look of the person standing in front of her that the carrying is finally done. He held out the final notebook. Volume 4, the original, not a copy. Agent Holt had confirmed that the family should have the physical object once the scanning was complete and the chain of custody documentation was filed, and Holt had kept her word on this without being reminded. Margaret took it the way she might take the hand of someone she had not seen in a very long time, with both of hers, carefully. Then she held it against her chest without opening it, the way you hold something you are not yet ready to look at, because looking at it will make it real in a way it has not quite been real until this moment, and you need one more breath before that happens. The last section, Ethan said. He wrote about you in it, not about the investigation, about Baltimore, about what he was working to protect. He paused. I thought you should have it in his handwriting, not in a court file. Margaret stood with the notebook against her chest for a long moment. Ash sat at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her with the amber eyes that were patient in the way that very old and very well-used things are patient without effort, as a condition of what they have become. He knew what was coming, she said. It was not a question. I think he knew it was possible, Ethan said. I think he made his preparations and kept working because the work was what he had, and stopping would have meant accepting something he was not willing to accept. She nodded slowly, the nod of a woman who recognizes the description from the inside from 15 years of living, with the absence of someone she had known well enough to recognize in a description given by a stranger who had only met him through 4 leather-bound notebooks. That was Daniel, she said. He always said that the only honest response to a difficult thing was to continue doing the next correct thing, whatever that happened to be, and then the one after that. She looked at Ethan steadily. Did the next correct things turn out to be enough? Ethan thought about Roy Lattimore standing in the snow with his hand on Ash's head, about the stone chimney standing unchanged while the building around it burned, about the cavity below the hearthstone dry and intact and exactly as Daniel Hart had left it. Yes, he said, it was enough. She was quiet for a moment that was longer than silence and shorter than a conversation. Then she said, I want to tell you something I have not told anyone, not the investigators, not Connor Reeves, not anyone. She looked past Ethan at the spring afternoon at the light on the hills to the west. The week before Daniel disappeared, he called me. He was calm. He sounded like himself. He said that he had finished what he had come to do, meaning the documentation, and that it was safe, and that no matter what happened, he needed me to know that. She looked back at Ethan. He said whatever happens after this, the work is done, and it is safe, and it will get to the right people when the time comes. He said he did not know when that would be. He said it might take a while. Her voice was steady, carrying its weight without faltering. I did not fully understand what he meant at the time. I thought he was telling me he was being careful. Now I understand he was telling me goodbye in the only way he could without saying goodbye. Ethan stood with that. He trusted that someone would find it, Margaret said. He built that hiding place, and he trusted that whoever was supposed to find it would find it when the time was right. He trusted that because he had to, because it was the only option he had left. And Daniel was always better at accepting the options that were actually available to him than most people are. She looked at Ethan directly. I have thought a great deal about who that person would need to be. What kind of person would buy a piece of land that an entire town was afraid of? What kind of person would listen to a 9-year-old buck instead of their own eyes? She paused. I stopped being surprised that it turned out to be a soldier. Daniel would not have been surprised either. She reached out and put one hand briefly on Ethan's arm, a gesture that was complete in itself and required no addition, no explanation, no reciprocation. Then she looked down at Ash, and the bong rose and came up the porch steps to her, and she put her hand on his broad head, and he stood still beneath it. And the two of them remained like that for a moment in the quiet of the spring afternoon, the woman and the dog, while Ethan stood and watched and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. She asked him to stay for coffee, and he did. And they sat at her kitchen table with the spring afternoon moving in through the window, and talked for perhaps an hour in the way that people talk when the main thing has already been said, and what remains is simply being in the same room with someone who understands why the main thing mattered. She told him things about Daniel that were not in the notebooks, the small, specific things that make a person real rather than representative. That he had been a poor cook, but a diligent one, willing to attempt anything regardless of the outcome. That he had loved Montana from the moment he arrived, found something in the scale of it that matched something in himself that Baltimore had never quite accommodated. That he had kept a list of books he intended to read and added to it compulsively and never made significant progress against it, which she had once found frustrating and now found endearing, in the way that everything you found frustrating about someone becomes endearing when they are no longer there to be frustrated with. Ethan told her what he knew about how Hart had built the hiding place, the care and foresight in it, the choice of the M2A1 box and the brick lining and the pitch sealant and the deliberate positioning beneath the hearth, where the heat from the fire above would create a thermal barrier against the ground cold below. He told her that the notebooks were in the condition they would have been in if they had been stored in a controlled archive, which was exactly what the hiding place had been, a controlled archive built by one person for another person, not yet identified, across an interval not yet determined. Margaret listened with the attention of someone who has been waiting a long time to hear this particular story told correctly by someone who had been close enough to it to tell it without embellishment or diminishment. When Ethan rose to leave, she walked him to the door and stood on the porch and looked out at her land, the spring green of it, the creek visible at the far edge of the property catching the late afternoon light. He would have liked you, she said. He liked people who did not need to explain themselves. Ethan nodded once. Take care of that dog, she said. He takes care of me, Ethan said. She smiled briefly, and it was the first time her face had done that in the hour he had been there, and it changed her face completely, made her look younger and more like the person she had been before. 15 years of a specific weight had been added to the person she already was. He drove home in the late afternoon with the window open, and Ash's nose working in the slipstream of the moving truck, and the mountains on all sides doing what they always did, which was hold their positions against the sky, regardless of what was happening at their feet, patient with the patience of things that measure time in centuries, and find the concerns of any particular decade forgettable. That evening, Ethan sat on the hearthstone at the center of the cabin's unfinished frame. The walls were not yet up, and the sky above was open, turning from the pale blue of late afternoon into the deeper blue of early evening as the last color drained from the western mountains. The creek talked to itself to the east. The pines at the clearing's edge held their dark shapes against the transitioning sky with the permanence of things that measure time in decades rather than days. He had the photocopy of Volume 1's first page in his shirt pocket, the one he had made in the library in Kalispell before sending the encrypted file to Connor, and had carried since. He took it out and read it one more time, not because he had forgotten it, but because some things are worth holding in the full and deliberate attention, and not just in the memory which softens and shifts things whether we intend it to or not. If you are reading this, I am no longer here to say it myself. He folded it along its original creases, returned it to his shirt pocket. Ash was lying against his leg, in the way the dog lay, when the working portion of the day was over the full relaxed weight of an animal that has completed what it came to do and is content with the completion. His breathing was deep and even. His eyes were closed. The gray and silver of his coat caught the last light of the day, and in that light against the warmth of the original stone, he looked like something that had always occupied this particular spot, something the land had been expecting. Ethan put his hand on the dog's back and felt the breathing move through his palm and into him. He had driven to Montana to find a place to put things down. He had found instead a place that needed something carried to its conclusion. Those two things had turned out in the end to be the same thing. The carrying was the putting down. The work was the rest. The direction he had been looking for had been inside the work and all along. He looked up at the sky, which was filling with the dense, precise stars that appear over Montana in late spring, when the air is clear and cold and clean, and the world has not yet warmed enough to create the haze that summer brings. Stars that have been there the whole time every night, hidden on the nights when clouds covered them, and simply present on the nights when they were not. He was going to finish the walls tomorrow. Roy Lattimore had offered to help on the weekend. Connor had said he would come back when the structure was roofed, and Ethan believed him because Connor was the kind of man who said what he intended to do. The creek continued its conversation to the east. An owl began somewhere in the pines. One long note, and then silence, and then the same note again. The first stars became visible at the edge of the sky over the mountains to the east and appearing one at a time, the way true things sometimes appear, not all at once but gradually, as the conditions for seeing them improve. Ethan Cole sat on the hearthstone of a cabin being built on the foundation of one that had burned above a cavity that had held a secret for 15 years and now held nothing but air, and the faint memory of what had rested there. And the sky above the open frame continued to reveal itself in the darkening star by patient star over the mountains, in the creek, in the clearing that was for the first time in 15 years, simply a piece of land where someone lived. He did not feel the need to be anywhere other than exactly where he was. Ash breathed against his legs, slow and even, the breathing of an old dog at rest after a long day of being exactly what he was built to be. Ethan kept his hand on the dog's back and felt the warmth and the rhythm of it, and let the stars continue to appear above him without counting them, without naming them, without any activity other than looking and being present in the specific place, in the specific moment, without requiring either of them to be something other than what they were. He thought about Ash finding the stone. He thought about the moment he had crouched beside the dog with the lantern and pressed the knife into the joint and felt the give of pitch instead of crumble of mortar, and the thing that had moved through him in that moment, which was not triumph or excitement, but something quieter and more specific. It was the sensation of a thing fitting into its place, the sensation of arriving somewhere that had been prepared for arrival, though no one who prepared it knew who would arrive or when. He thought about Daniel Hart sitting in a cabin not 50 feet from where Ethan now sat in the autumn of 2009, knowing that what he had built was as complete as he could make it, and that the window of his ability to complete it further was closing. Writing in those final pages with a hand that was slightly less controlled than the hand that had written the first 3 volumes, making his preparations with the care of a man who understood that the preparation was the last thing he had full control over. Sealing the pitch around the stone, trusting. It was an enormous thing to trust. To do the work and put it somewhere and trust that it would be found by the right person at the right time with no mechanism for ensuring either of those conditions, with no way of following up or verifying or adjusting. To simply do the thing correctly and release it into the uncertainty of time and chance and the decisions of people not yet known to you. Ethan had spent his adult life in institutions that were specifically designed to reduce the role of trust in outcomes, to replace trust with protocol and verification and redundant systems, because trust had proven insufficient in the kinds of situations his work involved, and something more reliable was required. The military was, among other things, an extensive and elaborate attempt to make outcomes less dependent on trust and more dependent on structure. He had believed in that project. He still believed in most of it. But Daniel Hart had had none of that. He had had a hiding place and a decision and a trust that someone would come. And here Ethan was. He thought about what Roy Lattimore had asked. Does it count if the person who made the promise does not get to see it through? He had given Roy the answer that was true, and he believed it. But sitting here now alone with the mom and the stars and the creek's conversation, he thought the question deserved a longer consideration than a clearing in the snow had allowed. It counted, yes, of course it counted. The counting was not the question. The question was what it cost Daniel Hart, specifically the thing that had been paid that could never be returned. The 2 years of work, the methodical documentation, the growing awareness that the walls were closing and the windows shrinking, all of it was in the record, in the notebooks, legible to anyone who read carefully. But what was not in the notebooks was the other thing, the thing that was present in the slightly less controlled handwriting of the final pages in the margin note about trusting Dale Morrow, in the single paragraph about the choice Gail had faced that ended with, "I am not sure I know what I would have done." What was not in the notebooks was Daniel Hart being afraid and continuing anyway. Being uncertain and continuing anyway. Watching the people he trusted most become the instruments of the thing threatening him, and continuing anyway because the next correct thing was to continue, and he was the kind of man who did the next correct thing. That was what had been paid, and it could not be returned. And the fact that the work survived and the evidence reached the people who needed it, and Warren Gale was now on his way to a courtroom, did not return it. What it did was make it mean something. Not nothing, not a waste, something. Ethan sat with that distinction for a while in the way that certain distinctions deserve to be sat with, without rushing to resolution, without deciding it means more or less than it means. The owl that had been calling from the pines shifted its position and called from a different direction, and Ash's ear moved slightly in his sleep toward the new location before settling again. The creek continued its consistent note to the east, the same volume it had held all evening, the voice of water that does not modulate its conversation for an audience. He thought about the morning he would get up and continue building, the methodical pleasure of it, the way each decision during construction led directly to the next, the way the work of making something required a kind of presence that other work did not. You could plan a building in your head, you could not build it there. It required being in the specific place with the specific materials and the specific conditions of the specific day, and responding to all of those things in real time, which left very little room for anything that was not the immediate work. He had found that he liked this. He had not expected to like it as much as he did. He had thought he was building a cabin. He was finding that he was also building something else, something that did not have a precise name, but that felt in the way it was progressing, like the thing he had come to Montana looking for, without being able to say clearly what he was looking for. Roy Lattimore had brought the second load of timber on a morning when the light was good and stayed for 3 hours working without ceremony, fitting boards and testing angles and making suggestions in the practical language of a man who had been building and repairing things on his own land for 5 decades. He had not talked about the trial or the contamination or his son's kidneys. He had talked about wood, which species held up best through freeze-thaw cycles, which joints were worth the extra time, where to put the south-facing windows to get the most winter light without losing wall space you needed for other things. Practical knowledge transferred from one person to another because it was useful, and because this was how such knowledge moved from person to person in conversations that were mostly about other things. Ethan had listened and learned and applied to what Roy told him, and the building that was taking shape was better for it than it would have been without it. This seemed in its small way like the right kind of return on a debt that could not otherwise be repaid. Connor would come back when the roof went on. He had said so twice, and Connor said things twice when he meant them. He would bring his camera because he was a journalist and could not help documenting things that deserved to be documented, and he would take photographs of the building and the clearing and the chimney that had stood through the fire, and he would write something about it for himself that he would probably never publish because some things were better as private records than public ones. Ethan would show him where the hearthstone had been repositioned at the center of the new floor plan, directly beneath the opening in the wall where the new fireplace would go back where it had always been. The cavity below it was empty, and had been empty since the day the FBI evidence team had opened it with care and documented its contents and removed them for processing. But the stone was still there. He had wanted it there. He had not been able to fully explain why to Agent Holt when she asked, and she had accepted his inability to explain it as a sufficient answer, which he appreciated. The stone was there because Daniel Hart had made it, because a man Ethan had never met had spent weeks or months building a hiding place under a hearthstone in a cabin in Montana, and the hiding place had worked, and the things it held had survived 15 years in a fire, and had reached the people they were meant to reach. The stone was there because some things deserve to be acknowledged by being kept even when what they held is gone, even when the function is no longer the reason. He looked up at the stars above the open frame of the cabin that was being built on the foundation of the one that had burned, and he counted the ones he could name, which was not many, and looked at the ones he could not name, which was the rest of them, and found, as he had been finding lately, that the ones he could not name were not less interesting for being nameless. They were simply there as they had always been there, as they would be there long after the cabin was finished and inhabited, and eventually abandoned again by someone whose name was not yet known, continuing to hold their positions in the sky with the indifference of things that have been doing this long enough that particular human concerns do not register against their scale. This did not diminish the particular human concerns. It simply placed them at their actual size, which was smaller than they felt from the inside, and larger than they appeared from very far away. Ethan Cole was 47 years old. He had done 20 years in service to his country, most of it in places that had required him to be a specific kind of person and had shaped him into that person through the instrument of necessity, which is the most effective shaping tool there is. He had come out of that service carrying things he had not fully cataloged and had spent several years trying to put down without knowing clearly what he was putting down or where the appropriate place for it was. He had found a piece of land for $500, a hiding place under a hearthstone, a dog who could smell what was hidden there, a dead man's 15 years of careful work, a valley full of people who deserved to know what had been done to the water they drank. He had found Roy Lattimore and Margaret Hart and Elmer Pruitt and Connor Reeves people who were each doing the next correct thing in their own particular circumstances in the specific way available to them, with the specific tools and knowledge and position they occupied. He had found somewhere in the middle of all of it, without planning to find it, without recognizing it when it arrived, a reason to be in this specific place at this specific time, which was not the same as a reason to exist, but was adjacent to it and perhaps sufficient for now, which was all now ever required. Ash breathed against his leg. The creek talked to itself. The stars continued to appear in the darkening blue above the open frame of the unfinished cabin, star by patient star filling in the dark between the dark, until the dark was full of light, and the night settled over the clearing, and the mountains, and the valley, and the whole enormous, indifferent, beautiful Montana landscape, with the completeness of something that has been doing this for longer than there has been anyone to watch it, and will continue doing it for longer than anyone now watching it will be here to see. Ethan Cole sat in the middle of all of it with his hand on the back of the dog who had found the thing worth finding, and he was, for the first time in longer than he could accurately say exactly where he was.